March 1943. A narrow apartment on Rue de la Hachette, Paris, 5th arrondissement. The walls are thin enough to hear neighbors coughing 3 floors down. A young woman named Andrée Borrel sits at a wooden table near a window that overlooks the Seine, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she folds a silk parachute into a travel bag. The fabric whispers against itself, a sound so soft it barely registers above the distant rumble of German trucks on the boulevard Saint-Michel. The room smells of cheap soap and damp plaster. Morning light filters through lace curtains, casting geometric shadows across her work. On the table, a forged identity card, a train ticket to Lyon, a lipstick case hollowed out to carry microfilm, and a small mirror angled to watch the street below. She checks the mirror every 40 seconds, not nervously, methodically, the way someone checks an instrument panel. Andrée is a courier for the Special Operations Executives Prosper Network, one of the largest Allied resistance circuits operating in occupied France. In her bag, intelligence reports on German troop movements, railway sabotage plans, and encoded messages destined for London. In her mind, 6 different cover stories, memorized train schedules, 3 safe houses she's never visited, and the knowledge that 17 couriers have been arrested in Paris in the past 4 months. She wears a blue cotton dress, practical shoes, and no jewelry. Her hair is pinned simply. Everything about her appearance has been calibrated to be unmemorable. The Gestapo has photographs of hundreds of suspected resistance members pinned to cork boards in their headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch. Andrée has seen those boards. She knows what happens when your face appears there. Outside, a black Citroën slows at the corner. Andrée's hand pauses mid-fold. The car idles for 8 seconds, long enough for her to memorize the license plate, count the occupants, note the absence of radio antenna, then continues north toward the Pantheon. She exhales slowly and returns to her packing. This moment, this ordinary morning ritual of preparation and calculated risk, represents a largely invisible war being fought across occupied Europe. While tanks rolled across battlefields and bombers darkened the skies, thousands of women moved through cities and countryside carrying the sinews of resistance, information, instructions, money, weapons, hope. They were couriers, and they operated inside a surveillance state designed specifically to detect and destroy them. The Gestapo, Abwehr, Sicherheitsdienst, and Milice Française deployed thousands of agents, informants, checkpoints, and monitoring systems to strangle resistance networks. They photographed train stations. They tracked ration card usage. They infiltrated networks with double agents. They tortured captured operatives until networks unraveled like pulled thread. And yet the courier networks persisted, adapted, evolved. The story of how they survived, how women like Andrée Borrel, Noor Inayat Khan, Vera Atkins, Nancy Wake, and thousands of unnamed others moved intelligence through a landscape saturated with watchers, is a story of tradecraft, psychology, improvisation, and a profound understanding of how surveillance systems actually function. It is also a story about what happens when authority underestimates those it considers powerless. The networks did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because they were smarter, because they understood that surveillance has blind spots, because they knew that systems designed by men who saw women as decorative or domestic would fail to recognize them as operators, because they turned the machinery of occupation against itself. By 1943, German intelligence had refined its surveillance apparatus to industrial efficiency, but efficiency creates patterns, patterns create predictability, and predictability creates exploitable weaknesses. The couriers learned to read those weaknesses the way cryptographers read codes. This is the story of that silent war, a war fought not with guns but with forged papers, memorized routes, and the ability to walk past a checkpoint carrying enough intelligence to hang everyone you know, and smile while doing it. Andrée finishes packing. She checks the mirror one last time, picks up her bag, and walks down 4 flights of stairs into the morning streets of occupied Paris. She has a train to catch, and the Gestapo is watching every station in the city. The machinery of Nazi surveillance in occupied Western Europe was neither improvised nor chaotic. By 1942, it had evolved into a layered system of overlapping authorities, each with specific jurisdictions, methods, and bureaucratic imperatives. Understanding how the courier networks survived requires understanding this architecture not as monolithic oppression, but as a complex organism with competing organs, blind spots, and exploitable seams. The Gestapo, Geheimstaatspolizei, secret state. Police held primary responsibility for internal security and resistance suppression. Its Section IV operated across occupied territories with broad arrest powers and minimal oversight. In France alone, the Gestapo maintained major operational centers in Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and Toulouse, supported by hundreds of smaller substations. Personnel strength in France by mid-1943, approximately 3,200 German officers and analysts, supplemented by an estimated 30,000 French informants and auxiliary police. But the Gestapo did not operate alone. The Abwehr German military intelligence ran its own networks focused on foreign espionage and military information. It competed with the Gestapo for resources, authority, and credit. This rivalry was not theoretical. In multiple documented cases, Abwehr operations deliberately withheld intelligence from Gestapo units to preserve operational advantage. The couriers learned to recognize this. When two agencies hunt the same target but refuse to share information, gaps emerge. The Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, added a third layer focused on ideological threats and political intelligence. In some cities, SD officers operated independent surveillance networks that overlapped with both Gestapo and Abwehr coverage. Jurisdictional boundaries were murky. Resentments ran deep. An agent watching a train platform for the Gestapo might not know that an SD team was watching the same platform from a different angle, tracking different suspects. Then came the French collaborationist forces, the Milice Française, created in January 1943 as a paramilitary police force under Vichy authority. The milice eventually grew to 30,000 members with intimate local knowledge that German intelligence could never replicate. They knew neighborhoods, families, dialects, routines. They recognized faces. But the milice also operated semi-independently, reported through French command structures, and frequently acted on local grudges rather than strategic intelligence priorities. This was the system. 4 major organizations, thousands of agents, uncounted informants, all watching a population of millions for signs of resistance activity. The couriers should have been crushed immediately. They were not. The first reason, the watchers were watching for men. German intelligence training in 1940-41 was built on assumptions shaped by the First World War and early Nazi Party experience. Resistance meant armed men. Sabotage meant demolition experts. Intelligence gathering meant military officers or Communist Party operatives, male categories. Women appeared in threat assessments primarily as auxiliaries, nurses, typists, safe house hosts, dangerous perhaps but not operational. SOE and French resistance leadership recognized this cognitive gap and weaponized it. By late 1942, Allied intelligence analysis showed that female couriers had a survival rate nearly double that of their male counterparts in comparable roles. The reason was simple. They were less likely to be stopped, searched, or subjected to intensive interrogation at checkpoints. A woman traveling alone with a shopping bag might be glanced at. A man traveling alone with a briefcase triggered scrutiny. The networks formalized this into doctrine. High-value intelligence, network structures, drop zone coordinates, sabotage timing increasingly moved through female couriers. Men carried weapons and explosives which were easier to detect and explain away as criminal rather than political activity. Women carried information which was invisible until you knew to look for it. But invisibility was only the first advantage. The second was mobility range. Gestapo surveillance focused heavily on known patterns: Communist Party meeting sites, union halls, cafes frequented by Spanish Civil War veterans, neighborhoods with high refugee populations. Male resistance members, particularly those with pre-war political affiliations, existed in databases. Their movements could be tracked, predicted, constrained. Women, especially young women with no prior political record, existed in a different category. They could move through checkpoints with forged papers identifying them as secretaries, governesses, nurses, shopgirls, occupations that explained travel, identities that suggested harmlessness. Andrée Borrel's false papers identified her as Denise Urbain, a nursery governess traveling to Lyon to accept a position with a wealthy family. The story was detailed enough to survive casual interrogation. The family name Rousseau, the address 14 Rue de la République, the children's ages 6 and 9, even the monthly salary 800 francs. If questioned, she could describe the interview process, the family's background, the children's temperaments. The Gestapo had no efficient way to verify these details across hundreds of thousands of domestic employment arrangements. This was the paradox. The more comprehensive the surveillance state became, the more it relied on categories, databases, and pattern recognition. And pattern recognition fails when the target does not fit the pattern. The third advantage was behavioral. Gestapo training manuals from 1942, copies of which were captured by Allied intelligence and now reside in archives, emphasized detecting nervous behavior as a primary indicator of deception: fidgeting, excessive sweating, avoiding eye contact, hesitant responses. The manuals assumed that guilty parties would betray themselves through involuntary physiological stress responses. The couriers trained specifically to control these responses. SOE finishing schools in England, Beaulieu in Hampshire was the primary facility, ran multi-week courses in what would now be called operational psychology. Students learned to manage heart rate through breathing techniques, to maintain eye contact without appearing aggressive, to answer questions with the minimal detail necessary to satisfy without inviting follow-up, to smile naturally under stress. More importantly, they learned to invert the interrogator's expectations. A Gestapo checkpoint officer expected suspects to appear nervous, therefore appearing calm, even slightly bored, read as innocence. The couriers practiced a specific kind of performance, mild annoyance at the delay, polite but not ingratiating responses, a visible desire to simply complete the transaction and continue their journey. They behaved like people for whom this checkpoint was an irritating bureaucratic inconvenience, not a life-threatening gauntlet. This worked because the Gestapo processed thousands of people daily. Checkpoints at major train stations might screen 10,000 travelers in a 12-hour period. Officers developed rapid triage instincts, flag the nervous, wave through the routine. The couriers learned to present as routine. But tradecraft alone was insufficient. The networks survived because they understood something deeper about the system. Surveillance creates fatigue, and fatigue creates exploitable vulnerabilities. By 1943, German occupation forces had been maintaining high alert status for 3 years. Checkpoint duty was mind-numbing, reviewing endless identity papers, searching endless bags, questioning endless travelers, 99% of whom were exactly what they claimed to be. The psychological strain of maintaining vigilance in an environment of constant false positives was documented in internal German reports, morale assessments that noted increasing alcoholism, absenteeism, and procedural shortcuts among surveillance personnel. The couriers timed their movements to exploit this fatigue, traveling during shift changes, choosing routes through smaller checkpoints with less supervision, crossing borders on Sundays when staffing was reduced, moving during major operations elsewhere when attention and resources were diverted. They were not merely evading surveillance, they were studying it, mapping it, predicting it, and moving through its weaknesses like water through cracks. And when the system adapted, they adapted faster. The train from Paris to Lyon departed Gare de Lyon at 7:43 a.m., scheduled arrival 2:15 p.m. Andrée Borrel boarded in the third-class carriage, chose a window seat in a compartment with 2 elderly women and a businessman reading a newspaper, and settled in for a journey that crossed 3 Gestapo checkpoint zones, 2 Abwehr surveillance sectors, and 1 newly established milice inspection point near Chalon-sur-Saône. She carried, concealed in the lining of her handbag, photographs of 4 Wehrmacht officers, a list of ammunition depot locations near Dijon, and microfilm containing radio frequencies for upcoming SOE drops. The intelligence represented 3 weeks of observation by a dozen operatives. If intercepted, it would allow the Gestapo to roll up networks across eastern France within 72 hours. Her ticket was genuine, purchased with legitimate francs. Her identity papers were forgeries, excellent forgeries, produced by SOE's documentation section using actual blank forms stolen from a Vichy prefecture, but forgeries nonetheless. Her cover story was memorized but untested, and she was about to pass through a system specifically designed to detect exactly what she was doing. The first checkpoint came at Fontainebleau, 37 minutes into the journey. German military police boarded the train, moving through carriages with mechanical efficiency. 2 officers per compartment, 1 checked papers while the other watched faces. Standard procedure documented in captured training protocols. The watching officer's job was not to verify documents but to observe reactions, the micro-expressions, postural shifts, and behavioral tells that indicated deception. Andrée kept her eyes on the landscape passing outside the window, not avoidance, simply disinterest in the routine. When the officer reached her compartment, she turned with mild attention, retrieved her papers from her handbag without fumbling, and handed them over with the faint smile of someone accustomed to bureaucratic formalities. The officer examined the papers for 11 seconds. Name, photograph, birth date, residence, occupation, travel, authorization. Everything aligned, everything appeared genuine because most of it was genuine. The document itself was real, only the information was false. The officer's eyes flicked from the photograph to her face twice, then back to the document. Purpose of travel. Employment, governess position in Lyon. Family name. Rousseau, 14 Rue de la République. Duration of stay. Permanent position. The exchange lasted 18 seconds. The officer returned her papers, nodded, and moved to the next passenger. The entire checkpoint process took 9 minutes. The train departed Fontainebleau at 8:31 a.m., 4 minutes behind schedule. Andrée returned her papers to her handbag and resumed watching the countryside. Her heart rate had elevated by approximately 15 beats per minute during the exchange, well within normal parameters for a civilian encountering authority. She had answered in the tone of someone mildly inconvenienced by questions she considered obvious. No hesitation, no excessive detail, no nervous elaboration. This was the first principle of courier tradecraft: provide exactly the information requested, nothing more. The second principle: never carry anything that appears to be hidden. The intelligence sewn into her handbag lining was invisible to visual inspection and undetectable without cutting the bag open. But the bag itself appeared ordinary, worn leather, practical design, the kind carried by thousands of working women across France. No false bottoms, no suspicious weight distribution, no modifications that would prompt suspicion if casually examined. Gestapo search protocols, as documented in multiple survivor testimonies and captured training materials, prioritized obvious concealment methods: hollow shoe heels, modified clothing, false bottom suitcases. These were techniques used by amateurs and they triggered immediate arrest. Professional couriers avoided them entirely. Instead, they used concealment that required deliberate, time-consuming effort to discover: sewn linings, microfilm hidden inside lipstick cases, messages written on silk that could be rolled into pencil-thin tubes and hidden in hairpins, intelligence that could survive a quick search but not a forensic examination. The bet was this: routine checkpoints conducted rapid searches. Forensic examinations occurred only after arrest. Therefore, the goal was not to survive forensic examination, that was impossible, but to avoid triggering the suspicion that led to forensic examination in the first place. This was the third principle: control the encounter's duration and depth. At Dijon, the second major checkpoint, the procedure changed. This was a Gestapo station, not Wehrmacht. The protocols were different, more thorough, more time-intensive. All passengers were required to disembark with their luggage and pass through an inspection hall adjacent to the platform. 3 lines, each staffed by 2 Gestapo officers and a French auxiliary. Average processing time per passenger, 3 to 5 minutes. Total passengers on Andrée's train, approximately 340. The delay would be substantial. She queued in the middle line, not the fastest moving that would suggest calculation, not the slowest that suggested avoidance, the middle line chosen without apparent deliberation. When her turn came, she placed her handbag and small suitcase on the inspection table. The Gestapo officer was in his late 20s, exhausted-looking, a coffee cup steaming at his elbow. The French auxiliary stood beside him, watching the queue. Papers, She provided them. The officer reviewed them with the same methodical attention as the Wehrmacht officer at Fontainebleau, but this time he also cross-referenced against a typed list on the table beside him. A list of names, wanted individuals, suspected operatives. Her name, her false name, was not on the list. Open the bag. She unclasped it and held it open for inspection. He glanced inside: compact comb, handkerchief, small purse, the lipstick case containing microfilm. He did not remove the items, did not probe the lining. The inspection took 7 seconds. The suitcase. She opened it: clothing, toiletries, a book. He lifted the top layer of clothes, glanced underneath, closed it. Destination: Lion. Employer: the Rousseau family, governess position. Address: 14 Rue de la République. The same answers, the same tone. He looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary, long enough that her heart rate spiked again, then stamped her papers and waved her through. Total duration, 3 minutes 40 seconds. She collected her belongings and walked toward the platform, maintaining the same unhurried pace as every other cleared passenger. No relief, no visible tension release, just the neutral demeanor of someone whose paperwork had been processed satisfactorily. But something had changed at Dijon. The officer had looked at her face longer than necessary. Not suspicion, exactly, something else, recognition perhaps, or assessment of a different kind. The networks had documented this phenomenon. Male officers at checkpoints sometimes detained attractive women not for security reasons but for personal ones. Some detentions led to assault. Some led to coerced arrangements, sexual favors in exchange for safe passage. This was the fourth principle, and the most dangerous: understand that you are simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. Female couriers were invisible as threats but visible as women. This duality created protection and vulnerability simultaneously. The same gender assumptions that allowed them to pass through checkpoints unchallenged also exposed them to a different category of danger, one that had nothing to do with intelligence work and everything to do with power. The networks developed protocols: travel in pairs when possible, avoid late-night trains, choose compartments with other women. If detained on false pretenses, comply superficially while sabotaging the encounter, claim illness, menstruation, religious obligations, create witnesses, create delays, create situations where the officer's actions would be observed by others. But protocols could not eliminate the risk, they could only manage it. Andrée reboarded the train at 11:47 a.m. The remaining journey to Lyon would take approximately 2.5 hours, with one more checkpoint at Chalon-sur-Saône, this one run by the Milice Française. The Milice checkpoint was the most dangerous. German officers were foreigners, occupiers. They knew cities and railways but not neighborhoods, not families, not the micro-details of regional identity. They could verify documents but not context. The Milice were French, they knew context. They could detect accents that didn't match claimed hometowns. They recognized faces from before the war. They understood local references, social networks, the invisible markers of authenticity that no forged document could replicate. And the Milice had something else, ideological conviction combined with social resentment. Many were working-class men who saw resistance members as bourgeois intellectuals and communists who had betrayed France. They were hunting their own countrymen, which meant they were hunting with personal investment, local knowledge, and the zealotry of converts. At Chalon-sur-Saône, Andrée disembarked again. The Milice checkpoint operated differently, less bureaucratic, more conversational. Officers engaged passengers in casual dialogue, probing for inconsistencies. When her turn came, the Milice officer was older, perhaps 50, with the weathered face of someone who had worked outdoors most of his life. "Where are you from, mademoiselle?" "Nantes originally, living in Paris the past 4 years." "Nantes, which arrondissement?" "Third, near Place Royale." "Ah, I have cousins in Nantes, the Durans, do you know them?" This was the trap, a test question, claim knowledge and be caught in a lie, deny knowledge and appear suspicious. Everyone knows someone in a city of 200,000. The name sounds familiar, but I couldn't say for certain. It's been several years. Non-committal, plausible. The officer smiled slightly, either satisfied or unconvinced, impossible to tell. "What brings you south?" "Employment, governess." "Good families in Lyon, you'll do well." He returned her papers, no stamp, no further questions, just a nod. She walked back to the train, boarded, and took her seat. The train departed at 12:51 p.m. 54 minutes to Lyon, no more checkpoints. She had carried intelligence across 466 kilometers, through 4 inspection zones, past dozens of officers specifically trained to detect people like her. The intelligence would reach Lyon intact. From there it would be transferred to another courier who would carry it to a radio operator who would transmit it to London, where it would inform targeting decisions that would save Allied lives. This was not exceptional, this was routine. Hundreds of couriers made similar journeys every week across occupied Europe. Most succeeded, some were caught. The mathematics of resistance operate within acceptable loss rates while maintaining network integrity. But survival was not about luck. It was about understanding that the watchers were human, that humans tire, that systems have patterns, that authority expects certain performances and can be deceived by delivering those performances flawlessly. The train rolled through the suburbs of Lyon at 2:19 p.m., 4 minutes behind schedule. Andrée gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark into a city where new dangers waited, where different watchers operated under different protocols, where the work would begin again. Lyon, March 1943, the Cit. WWII had become the unofficial capital of French resistance, a designation that made it simultaneously the most vital and most dangerous operational theater in occupied France. While Paris remained under direct German military administration, Lyon sat in the so-called Zone Libre until November 1942, when Wehrmacht forces crossed the demarcation line and occupied the whole of France. That 8-month delay had allowed resistance networks to establish deep roots, safe houses, courier routes, forger workshops, radio transmission sites, arms caches. By early 1943, Lyon hosted at least 14 major resistance networks, including Combat, Libération Sud, Franc-Tireur, and multiple SOE circuits. The city's geography favored clandestine operations, narrow medieval streets in the Via Lyon, warrens of silk-weaving workshops on the Croix-Rousse Hill, miles of traboules, covered passageways connecting buildings that allowed movement without appearing on streets. A courier could enter a building on Rue Saint-Jean and emerge 3 blocks away on Rue du Boeuf without ever being visible from the street. The Gestapo knew this. Their Lyon headquarters, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Barbie, operated from the hotel terminus near the Perec station. Barbie's section had one primary mission: destroy the resistance infrastructure in Lyon and across the southeast zone. His methods were documented in post-war testimony as systematic, brutal, and increasingly effective throughout 1943. The Gestapo's Lion operation employed approximately 80 German personnel supported by 200–300 French agents and informants. They maintained surveillance on known resistance meeting sites, infiltrated networks with double agents, and conducted regular sweeps of suspected safe houses. Captured operatives were interrogated at the hotel terminus, using techniques designed to extract network information rapidly, techniques that worked often enough to make every arrest a potential catastrophe for dozens of others. The courier networks responded by compartmentalizing. Individual couriers knew only their immediate contacts, the person who gave them intelligence and the person who received it. They did not know the origin of the intelligence or its ultimate destination. They did not know the real names of contacts. They did not know safe house locations beyond their immediate route. This cellular structure meant that a captured courier could only compromise 2 or 3 others, not entire networks. But compartmentalization created its own problem: coordination. Resistance operations required synchronized action. Sabotage teams needed to know when railway attacks would occur. Radio operators needed to know when parachute drops were scheduled. Intelligence analysts needed to know what information was already collected to avoid duplication. Safe houses needed to know when to expect arrivals. All of this required communication across compartmentalized cells, and communication required couriers. By mid-1943, the volume of courier traffic in Lyon had become extraordinary. On any given day, dozens of women moved through the city carrying messages, money, forged documents, and intelligence. They met in cafes, churches, markets, train stations, public spaces where brief encounters appeared innocent. The meetings followed strict protocols: specific times, recognition phrases, backup plans, abort signals. A typical courier might make 6 to 8 contacts in a single day, moving across the city on foot or by tram, never taking the same route twice, never establishing predictable patterns. The workload was physically exhausting and psychologically draining. Every contact was a potential trap. Every public space was potentially surveilled. Every person was potentially an informant. The Gestapo understood that high courier traffic indicated active networks. They assigned agents to observe patterns: women who appeared repeatedly in certain neighborhoods, who met briefly with multiple individuals, who traveled without apparent purpose. Surveillance teams photographed suspects, tracked their movements, and built dossiers. When sufficient evidence accumulated, they arrested, not immediately upon suspicion, but after observation, when arrests could yield maximum intelligence about network structures. This created a temporal arms race. The Gestapo needed time to observe and build cases. The networks needed to operate faster than observation could solidify into actionable intelligence. Couriers rotated frequently, changing appearance, varying routes, using multiple false identities. A woman operating as Denise Urban one week might become Marie Fontaine the next, with different papers, different cover story, different appearance. The networks also developed counter-surveillance protocols. Before every meeting, couriers conducted surveillance detection routes, deliberate patterns designed to reveal followers. A courier might enter a shop, exit through a rear door, double back through trabbles, board a tram and disembark one stop later, enter a church and observe who followed. If surveillance was detected, the meeting was aborted using prearranged signals. But the most sophisticated adaptation was psychological. The networks realized that the Gestapo's strength, its systematic approach, was also a weakness. The Gestapo operated on evidence. They needed patterns, repetition, corroboration. A single sighting of a woman in a cafe meant nothing. 10 sightings over 2 weeks meant something. Therefore, the goal was not to be invisible, but to be visible in ways that generated meaningless data. Couriers began conducting false flag operations, meeting innocent civilians in public spaces, creating the appearance of suspicious activity where none existed. This flooded Gestapo surveillance teams with false positives, diluting real intelligence with noise. It forced the Gestapo to expend resources investigating dead ends. It created exhaustion and doubt among analysts trying to separate signal from static. One SOE report from mid-1943, now in British National Archives, describes the technique. Our couriers deliberately create patterns of innocent behavior that mimic clandestine activity, forcing enemy surveillance to waste resources distinguishing between genuine operations and theater. This was the evolution of the invisible war, not simply evading surveillance but actively manipulating it, turning the watchers' tools against them, creating environments where certainty became impossible. But the Gestapo adapted too. In April 1943, Klaus Barbie's section began using a new technique: parallel construction. Instead of observing couriers to map networks, they arrested couriers on fabricated charges, black market violations, curfew infractions, paperwork discrepancies, then searched them thoroughly. If intelligence materials were found, they had legal pretext for detention and interrogation. If nothing was found, they released the courier and observed who she contacted afterward, assuming that an arrest would trigger network responses. This technique bypassed the counter-surveillance protocols. It didn't matter if couriers detected surveillance because the arrest appeared to be for unrelated offenses. It created paranoia within networks, where every random arrest might be targeted, where every release might indicate compromise. The networks countered with cooling-off protocols. After any arrest, even if released, a courier was pulled from operations for weeks, sometimes months. Their contacts were changed, their routes were altered, their identity was retired. This protected networks but reduced operational capacity, exactly the Gestapo's goal. The courier war became a war of attrition. Each side developed new techniques. Each side adapted to the other's adaptations. Networks survived not because they won, but because they lost slowly enough to maintain minimal operational capability. And losses accelerated throughout 1943. On June 21, 1943, the Gestapo arrested Jean Moulin, de Gaulle's personal representative and coordinator of major French resistance movements, at a meeting in Caluire, a suburb of Lyon. Moulin's arrest resulted from either betrayal or sophisticated surveillance, and it nearly shattered resistance coordination across southern France. Moulin died from torture injuries weeks later, never having revealed critical information, but his capture demonstrated that even the most protected figures were vulnerable. The arrests continued: radio operators, circuit leaders, couriers, safe house operators. By August 1943, the Prosper network in Paris, the circuit Andrée Borrel worked for, collapsed under mass arrests. Over 150 operatives were captured in a coordinated sweep. Andrée herself was arrested on June 23, 1943. She was interrogated at Avenue Foch, then deported to Germany. She died at Natzweiler-Stratzenhof concentration camp in July 1944, executed by lethal injection, and then cremated. Her story was not unique, it was representative. The historical record shows that of approximately 480 SOE agents sent into France between 1941 and 1944, at least 118 were captured. Of the 39 female SOE agents sent to France, 13 were arrested. Of those 13, 4 survived the war. The others died in concentration camps, executed as spies. The mathematics were brutal. The networks understood the mathematics. They operated anyway because the alternative was surrender. But the arrests revealed something crucial. The networks that survived longest were not those with the best couriers, they were those with the best systems. Individual brilliance mattered less than organizational discipline. A network with excellent compartmentalization, strict rotation protocols, and rapid response to compromise could lose half its operatives and rebuild. A network that relied on a few exceptional individuals collapsed when those individuals were captured. The courier networks that persisted into 1944 had become something unprecedented: distributed intelligence systems with no single point of failure, operating inside a hostile surveillance state, adapting faster than their opponents could destroy them. They did not win because they were invincible. They won because they understood that victory meant survival. That survival meant losing slower than the enemy could exploit losses. That adaptation was continuous. That today's successful technique would be tomorrow's fatal pattern. And they won because the women who carried intelligence through occupied cities understood something that the Gestapo, for all its efficiency, never fully grasped. Invisibility is not about being unseen. It is about being seen and dismissed, about fitting expectations so perfectly that you become part of the landscape. The watchers were watching, they were always watching, but they were watching for the wrong things. The collapse of Prosper in June 1943 sent shockwaves through SOE headquarters in London and across resistance networks in France. The catastrophe was comprehensive: over 150 arrests in coordinated sweeps across Paris and the surrounding region, radio operators, couriers, circuit leaders, safe house hosts, arms cache guardians. The Gestapo had penetrated the network deeply enough to strike simultaneously at multiple nodes, preventing warning cascades that might have allowed others to escape. Post-war investigations revealed the cause: a combination of infiltration, betrayal, and tradecraft failures. A double agent named Henry Dericourt, working as an SOE air operations officer, had been providing the Abwehr with intelligence on incoming agents and supply drops. His information, combined with radio operator errors that allowed German detection of transmission patterns, gave the Gestapo the architecture of the network. When they moved with precision. The Prosper collapse forced a fundamental reassessment of courier operations. If a network as sophisticated and well-resourced as Prosper could be destroyed in a matter of days, What did that mean for smaller circuits with fewer resources and less experienced personnel? SOE's response was documented in internal memoranda from July and August 1943, now declassified. The directives emphasized several principles: shorter operational lifespans for individual couriers, increased rotation frequency, stricter compartmentalization, and most significantly, deliberate redundancy. Instead of one courier carrying critical intelligence, multiple couriers would carry fragments. No single capture could compromise complete information. But implementation was difficult. Couriers were scarce. Training took months. Deployment was dangerous. Many agents failed to complete even one successful mission before being captured or killed. The supply of trained operatives could not match the demand for operational capacity. The networks adapted by recruiting locally. Women already living in occupied France, who knew the territory, spoke French natively, understood local customs, and could operate without the vulnerabilities of parachuted agents. Local recruits had advantages: no suspicious arrival patterns, no foreign accents under stress, no unfamiliarity with current conditions. But they also had vulnerabilities: family connections that could be exploited, neighbors who might recognize them, pre-war histories that Gestapo databases might contain. By autumn 1943, the composition of courier networks had shifted. The women carrying intelligence through French cities were less likely to be British-trained SOE agents and more likely to be French civilians, shopgirls, nurses, students, clerks, who had decided that survival under occupation required resistance. Their motivations varied. Some were ideological, communists, Gaullists, or simply patriots who refused collaboration. Some were personal, family members arrested, neighbors deported, loved ones killed. Some were situational, recruited after stumbling across resistance activity, then choosing involvement over denial. But regardless of motivation, they faced identical risks. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, leader of the Alliance Network, one of the most effective intelligence-gathering circuits of the war, later described the courier reality in her memoir Noah's Ark. "We lost them constantly. Every week brought news of arrests. Some we heard about through Gestapo announcements. Some simply disappeared and we never learned their fate. We developed protocols for replacing couriers rapidly because we knew replacement would be continuous." The Alliance Network employed over 3,000 agents at its peak, including hundreds of couriers. Fourcade estimated that approximately 500 of her operatives were arrested during the war. Of those, roughly 200 died in concentration camps or were executed. The network continued operating because it could absorb losses and rebuild, a grim arithmetic of resistance. The surviving couriers developed something that training could not provide: OPE. Rational instinct, an awareness of danger that existed below conscious thought, the ability to sense surveillance before seeing it, to recognize when a checkpoint felt wrong, to know when to abort a mission based on atmospheric cues that could not be articulated in after-action reports. Nancy Wake, a New Zealand-born SOE agent who worked as a courier in France before the Prosper collapse forced her to flee to Britain, described this instinct in post-war interviews. "You developed a feeling, not supernatural, just attention to tiny details. The way people positioned themselves at a cafe, how long a car stayed parked, whether the same face appeared in two different locations. Your survival depended on noticing what others dismissed as coincidence." This instinct was not infallible, but it was the difference between a 6-week operational lifespan and a 6-month one, between completing 10 missions and completing 50, between dying in 1943 and surviving to 1944. And 1944 mattered, because 1944 was when the strategic value of courier networks reached its apex. The Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day, June 6, 1944, depended on intelligence that only ground networks could provide. Coastal defenses, Wehrmacht troop movements, fortification locations, railway schedules, bridge capacities, fuel depot positions. The kind of tactical real-time information that aerial reconnaissance could not capture and that signals intelligence could not decode because it was never transmitted electronically. This intelligence moved through courier networks. In the months before D-Day, the volume of intelligence flowing from France to London increased dramatically. SOE and French resistance circuits intensified observation and reporting. Couriers carried more information, more frequently, through increasingly militarized zones as the Germans fortified coastal regions and expanded security patrols. The risks escalated accordingly. Checkpoint procedures tightened. Searches became more thorough. Gestapo presence increased. The statistical probability of arrest rose with every mission. But the missions continued because the strategic stakes justified the risk. One specific case illustrates the operational reality: the intelligence that allowed Allied forces to identify and target Wehrmacht panzer divisions positioned near Caen. In late May 1944, Resistance observers near Caen documented the arrival of the 21st Panzer Division and elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, critical mobile reserves that could counterattack Allied beachheads if deployed quickly. This information needed to reach London immediately, but radio transmission was too risky due to German direction-finding capabilities. A courier identity unknown designation ANGLIQ in surviving SOE files carried the intelligence from Caen to Paris by bicycle, a journey of approximately 240 kilometers across multiple Wehrmacht security zones. From Paris, another courier carried it to a radio operator in Chartres who transmitted it to London. Total transit time 4 days. The intelligence reached Allied planners 8 days before D-Day. Based on that intelligence, Allied air forces targeted the Panzer divisions with intensive bombing on June 5-6, delaying their deployment toward the beaches by critical hours. Post-war analysis concluded that this delay contributed significantly to Allied success in establishing beachheads against counterattack. The courier known as ANGLIQE was never identified in declassified records. Her fate is unknown. She is one of thousands whose names do not appear in histories, whose sacrifices are documented only as operational successes, not individual stories. This anonymity was often deliberate. Networks used code names, not real names. Files were destroyed routinely to prevent capture from compromising others. Many couriers operated under deep cover with false identities that they maintained until death. Post-war efforts to document resistance activities struggled to identify individuals whose entire operational existence had been designed to be untraceable. The result is a historical record filled with ghosts, operations that succeeded, intelligence that arrived, missions that were completed, all carried out by people whose names we do not know. But the anonymity also reflects something essential about the courier networks. They were systems, not hero narratives. Individual courage mattered, but systemic resilience mattered more. The networks that survived were those that could lose individuals without losing capability, that could replace captured couriers within days, that could reroute intelligence through alternate paths when primary routes were compromised. This was the final evolution of the invisible war, the transformation of couriers from individuals into interchangeable components of a distributed intelligence infrastructure. It was dehumanizing in one sense, people reduced to functions, but it was also the only way to survive a war of attrition against an opponent with superior resources. And it worked. The courier networks delivered intelligence that shaped the outcome of the war, not decisively. No single intelligence source is decisive, but meaningfully. The Allied invasion succeeded partly because commanders knew where German forces were positioned, and they knew because women on bicycles carried that information across occupied France while the Gestapo watched for threats they had been trained to recognize, and these women did not fit the pattern. By August 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. Paris was liberated on August 25. The German occupation of France collapsed. Resistance networks emerged from underground, their members suddenly visible, their work suddenly acknowledged. The couriers who survived found themselves in a strange position, celebrated for work that required invisibility, honored for sacrifices that had been designed to be deniable, asked to speak about operations whose success had depended on silence. Many chose continued silence. The work had been traumatic: arrest, torture, execution of friends, the constant stress of operating under surveillance, the guilt of surviving when others did not. Post-war France was not always kind to women who had operated in moral gray zones, who had lied professionally, who had relationships with multiple contacts whose true identities they never knew. Some couriers received official recognition. Nancy Wake received medals from Britain, France, and the United States. Virginia Hall, an American SOE agent who operated as a courier in Lyon before escaping to Spain, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman so honored during the war. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade was made a commander of the Legion of Honor. But most received nothing beyond survival. Their files remained classified for decades, their work was unacknowledged, their contributions were invisible just as their operations had been. The liberation of France in 1944 did not end the story of the courier networks. It transformed their legacy into questions that would be debated for decades. How many couriers had there been? How many had died? What had their work actually accomplished? And why had their contributions been so thoroughly minimized in post-war narratives? The numerical accounting proved difficult. SOE records documented the 39 female agents it had trained and deployed to France, but those represented only a fraction of total courier activity. French resistance networks operated independently of British intelligence, and their record-keeping was fragmentary by necessity. Many networks destroyed files as the occupation collapsed to protect members from potential reprisals. Post-war efforts to reconstruct resistance activities relied on survivor testimony, which was incomplete and often contradictory. Current historical estimates suggest that several thousand women served as couriers in France between 1940 and 1944. The exact number is unknowable. What is known: hundreds were arrested, dozens were executed, and the majority survived anonymously. The fate of specific couriers, where documented, reveals the operational costs. Andrée Borrel, arrested June 1943, was transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, then to Natzweiler-Struthof, where she was executed by lethal injection in July 1944. Her body was cremated. No grave exists. Nourinayat Khan, an SOE radio operator who also served as a courier, was arrested in October 1943 after her network was penetrated. She was held at Gestapo headquarters in Paris, then transferred to Forchheim prison in Germany, where she was held in solitary confinement and repeatedly interrogated. In September 1944, she was transferred to Dachau concentration camp and executed by shooting. She was 30 years old. Odette Sansom, an SOE courier operating in southern France, was arrested in April 1943 along with her circuit leader. She was interrogated at Fresnes prison, tortured, then deported to Ravensbrück. She survived by claiming to be related to Winston Churchill, a lie that granted her value as a potential hostage. She was liberated in May 1945 and later awarded the George Cross. Violette Charbot, an SOE agent who served as both courier and sabotage operative, was arrested in June 1944 after a firefight with Wehrmacht forces. She was interrogated in Paris, deported to Ravensbrück, and executed in February 1945, 3 months before the camp's liberation. These cases, documented because they involved SOE agents whose files were eventually declassified, represent a tiny fraction of total losses. French couriers whose work was identical but whose employment was not British left fewer records. Some are commemorated on local memorials. Some appear in regional resistance histories. Many are completely undocumented. The question of what the courier networks accomplished is easier to answer. Without the intelligence they carried, Allied planning for D-Day would have been significantly degraded. Without their coordination of resistance activities, the railway sabotage campaign that delayed German reinforcements after the Normandy landings would have been impossible. Without their networks, SOE supply operations, parachute drops of weapons and equipment, could not have functioned at scale. A 1945 SOE assessment, now in British National Archives, concluded the courier services provided by both trained agents and local volunteers were indispensable to resistance operations in France. No alternative communication method could have provided equivalent security, reliability, and information transfer capacity. The strategic impact was real, but the post-war recognition was limited. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, France celebrated military resistance, the Free French forces, the Maquis fighters, the armed uprisings in Paris and other cities. These were visible, masculine, and easily narrativized as heroic. Courier work, quiet, invisible, performed largely by women, fit awkwardly into liberation mythology. British recognition was similarly constrained. SOE's operations remained classified for decades. The female agents who had served in France were asked to sign Official Secrets Act declarations and told not to discuss their work. Some complied, some did not. Nancy Wake spoke openly about her experiences becoming something of a public figure. Others maintained silence until death. The gendered dimension of this erasure was not accidental. Post-war societies in Britain and France reverted to traditional gender expectations rapidly. Women who had operated in combat zones, who had killed, who had exercised operational authority, who had made life and death decisions, these women challenged narratives about feminine domesticity and masculine protection. Their stories were uncomfortable. It was easier to remember the male paratroopers, commandos, and Maquis fighters. Easier to celebrate overt violence than covert intelligence. Easier to honor those who fit traditional heroism templates than those who operated in moral gray zones, using deception, seduction, and manipulation as weapons. The first major public recognition of female SOE agents came in 1958 with the publication of Odette, the story of a British agent, which was adapted into a film. But the narrative focused on Odette Sansom's torture and survival, her victimization and endurance, more than her operational effectiveness. The film presented her as a woman who suffered nobly, not as an intelligence professional who executed missions successfully. This pattern repeated in subsequent representations. Female resistance members were portrayed as brave victims or as exceptional outliers, not as components of functional military intelligence infrastructure. The systemic nature of their work, the networks, protocols, and tradecraft that made their operations possible, was largely ignored in favor of individual heroism narratives. Academic historiography began correcting this in the 1980s and 1990s. Historians like M.R.D. Foote, who wrote the official history of SOE in France, documented the scope and significance of courier operations. Margaret Rossiter's Women in the Resistance provided detailed analysis of female participation across multiple networks. More recent works by historians like Sarah Helm, Lynn Olson, and Sonia Purnell have reconstructed individual stories and systemic operations with greater nuance. But popular understanding still lags. The courier networks remain largely unknown outside specialist history circles. School curricula mention resistance in passing. Public memory focuses on dramatic moments, D-Day, liberation, famous battles. The quiet work of moving information across hostile territory does not generate the same commemorative energy. This matters because the lessons of courier networks are relevant beyond historical interest. The networks demonstrated that decentralized systems with strong compartmentalization and rapid adaptation can survive in hostile surveillance environments, that anonymity and redundancy are more valuable than individual brilliance, that systems designed to watch for one kind of threat will miss others, that assumptions about who is dangerous and who is harmless create exploitable blind spots. These principles apply to contemporary intelligence operations, cybersecurity, information warfare, and resistance movements operating under authoritarian regimes. The tradecraft developed by couriers in occupied France, dead drops, recognition signals, counter-surveillance routes, compartmentalized communication, remains foundational to modern clandestine operations. Moreover, the networks prove that decentralized resistance can function at scale without centralized command. The courier systems that survived did so not because of brilliant leadership, but because of distributed decision-making, local initiative, and operational flexibility. When centralized networks like Prospers collapsed, decentralized networks adapted and continued. This has implications for understanding how resistance movements function in general. Authoritarian regimes prefer visible hierarchies because they can be targeted. Leaders can be arrested. Organizations can be banned. But distributed networks are resilient precisely because they lack single points of failure. The Nazi occupation of France was comprehensive, well-resourced, and sophisticated. The Gestapo, Abwehr, and SD deployed thousands of personnel and cutting-edge surveillance technology. They had legal authority, military backing, and the ability to use unlimited force. They controlled borders, transportation, communication, and civil administration. And yet they could not stop women from carrying pieces of paper across cities. This was not because the couriers were exceptionally skilled, though many were. It was because surveillance systems, no matter how comprehensive, cannot process infinite information. They must prioritize, they must categorize, they must develop heuristics for distinguishing threats from background noise. The couriers exploited this fundamental limitation. They understood that being miscategorized was better than being invisible, that fitting stereotypes was protective, that systems optimized for detecting one threat profile would miss others. The final lesson is this: power is not absolute, occupation is not total. Even in environments designed to eliminate resistance, small spaces exist where agency survives. Information can flow through cracks, people can coordinate despite surveillance, systems can be opposed even when opposition appears futile. The courier networks proved this not through exceptional heroism but through ordinary persistence. They operated day after day, mission after mission, despite knowing the odds. They replaced captured colleagues and continued. They adapted to new threats and persisted. They lost battles constantly but never stopped fighting. This is not a narrative of inevitable victory or righteous triumph. Many couriers died, many networks collapsed, much intelligence never reached its destination. The work was brutal, traumatic, and often futile. But it was not entirely futile. The intelligence reached London, the operations continued, the networks survived long enough to matter. And that is the truest measure of success in asymmetric conflicts. Not decisive victory, but survival long enough to contribute to outcomes shaped by many forces, of which your contribution is one thread among thousands. The women who carried messages through occupied France understood this. They did not expect parades or recognition. They expected to do the work until they were caught or until the war ended, whichever came first. For many, capture came first. For some, liberation came first. For all, the work defined the rest of their lives, whether they spoke of it or not, whether it was recognized or not. The courier networks were never entirely defeated, because defeat would have required capturing every courier simultaneously, and no surveillance system could achieve that. As long as one courier remained operational, intelligence could flow. As long as intelligence flowed, resistance continued. As long as resistance continued, occupation was incomplete. This was their victory, not that they won, but that they could not be entirely eliminated, that the machinery designed to crush them could slow them but not stop them. That information, carried by women the system had been designed to dismiss, moved through the heart of the occupation until the occupation itself collapsed. The watchers watched, the couriers moved anyway, and the information reached its destination.